In the heart of West Africa, a story erupted that captured the imagination of the world and ignited fierce debates across continents. Ibrahim Traoré, when the young and fiery leader of Burkina Faso announced that his government had captured a French spy operating on Burkinabe soil, the news did not just ripple through Ouagadougou or Paris. It created a tidal wave of reactions that spread across Africa, Europe, and the United States. It was a moment that was not just about espionage, but about history, pride, geopolitics, and the shifting balance of power in a region that for too long had lived under the shadow of foreign influence. For many, it was a moment of vindication, a chance for an African leader to stand tall and declare that sovereignty was no longer a negotiable principle. For others, especially in Western circles, it was alarming, destabilizing, and a reminder of how quickly geopolitics could change when young leaders refused to play by the old rules. The capture of the French operative was presented by Traoré's government as a triumph of vigilance and national security. According to reports, the spy had been gathering intelligence on Burkina Faso's new security alliances and internal decision-making, possibly to undermine the government or pass sensitive information back to Paris. For Traoré, who has built his reputation on standing up to France and calling out neo-colonial interference, this was the perfect storm. He could hold up the captured spy as living proof of French meddling, evidence that Burkina Faso's struggles were not just internal, but the result of foreign sabotage. In his televised address to the nation, Traoré did not mince words. He declared that the sovereignty of Burkina Faso was sacred and that anyone, be they mercenaries, spies, or collaborators, who dared to undermine it would face consequences. His words were fiery, his tone unwavering, and his message crystal clear. The era of silent submission was over. The Burkinabe people responded with thunderous applause in the streets. Crowds gathered, waving flags, chanting Traoré's name, and demanding justice against the captured spy. To them, this was more than an isolated incident. It was a symbolic victory against decades of humiliation. France had long been seen as the invisible hand manipulating African politics, the former colonial power that never truly let go. Every coup, every election crisis, and every economic decision seemed to carry whispers of French influence. Now, with the spy in custody, those whispers were suddenly shouts. People felt validated. They had long suspected such interference, and now here was tangible proof. In Paris, the response was swift and defensive. French officials denied the allegations, insisting that the so-called spy was merely a diplomat or a civilian who had been wrongly detained. They accused Traoré of manufacturing a spectacle to distract from his own domestic challenges. The French media, predictably, echoed this line, portraying the event as propaganda from a young leader seeking to solidify his grip on power. Yet behind closed doors, intelligence officials in Europe and the United States understood the gravity of the situation. Even if Paris refused to acknowledge it publicly, the idea that a Western operative had been caught in the act was a major embarrassment. It sent shockwaves through diplomatic channels and raised difficult questions about what France was really doing in West Africa. For the United States, the incident was observed with careful interest. Washington has long had a complicated relationship with Africa. On the one hand, America positions itself as a supporter of freedom, democracy, and sovereignty. On the other hand, the U.S. understands that Africa has become a chessboard where China, Russia, and now independent-minded African leaders like Traoré are carving out spheres of influence. While many Americans may not follow the intricacies of Burkinabe politics, the symbolism of a young African leader standing up to France carried echoes of the American Revolution itself. Resisting imperial control, demanding self-determination, and capturing those who would subvert liberty. For a pro-American audience, the parallel was impossible to miss. The capture also exposed the fragility of France's image in Africa. Once seen as a dominant power, France has struggled in recent years to maintain its influence as younger generations of Africans grow increasingly vocal about neo-colonialism. In Mali, Niger, and now Burkina Faso, leaders have expelled French troops, rejected French aid, and sought new alliances. For many Africans, Ibrahim Traoré symbolizes a turning point, a refusal to be dictated to by Paris. The spy scandal only reinforced that narrative. It painted France not as a benevolent partner, but as a meddler desperate to cling to influence it no longer deserved. The Burkina Faso government capitalized on the moment, releasing carefully curated footage of the arrest, showing documents allegedly seized from the operative, and even hinting that the spy had been in contact with local collaborators. Whether all of it was true or embellished, it didn't matter. The optics were powerful. For the average Burkina Faso citizen, the message was clear. Their leader had outsmarted France and defended the nation's dignity. In African social media circles, memes and slogans exploded, with images of Traoré depicted as a lion catching a trespassing fox, a David standing against Goliath, a modern hero reclaiming African pride. But beyond the symbolism, the incident raised deeper questions. If France really was spying on Burkina Faso, what was its endgame? Was it to topple Traoré, destabilize his alliances with Russia, or prevent his vision of an independent Africa from gaining momentum? And what would happen next? Would France retaliate diplomatically, economically, or covertly? Would Traoré put the spy on trial, expose classified information, or even exchange him for concessions? Every possibility carried enormous weight. For the United States, the spy scandal served as a lesson in both opportunity and caution. On the one hand, America could quietly applaud the pushback against France, recognizing that an Africa free of French dominance could open new doors for U.S. influence and partnership. On the other hand, Washington had to tread carefully, ensuring that anti-French sentiment did not morph into broader anti-Western sentiment that could push African nations further into the arms of Russia or China. American analysts debated whether Traoré was a reckless populist or a shrewd strategist. But one thing was undeniable: he had managed to do what few African leaders dared, publicly humiliate a Western power. Inside Burkina Faso, the spy's capture ignited conversations that went beyond politics. Families spoke about sovereignty at dinner tables. University students debated the legacy of colonialism. Elders who had lived through independence compared Traoré's defiance to the dreams of their generation. For African Americans watching from afar, the story resonated deeply. Many saw in Traoré's boldness an echo of their own struggles against oppression and systemic control. The idea of resisting a powerful foreign hand was not foreign to those who had fought for civil rights, equality, and respect in America. The symbolism connected the African continent to its diaspora in profound ways. Still, there were those who cautioned against blind celebration. Critics noted that exposing a spy was one thing, but sustaining national stability was another. Burkina Faso remained plagued by terrorism, poverty, and internal divisions. Would this victory against France translate into better governance, or would it merely distract from deeper challenges? These were questions many Western observers asked, while African supporters dismissed them as attempts to downplay the significance of the moment. The French spy, held in custody, became almost a mythical figure. Rumors swirled about his identity, his mission, and the secrets he carried. Some claimed he had been caught trying to bribe officials. Others suggested he was mapping out security weaknesses for a possible intervention. The truth may never be fully known, but in the court of public opinion, the verdict had already been delivered. France was guilty of interference, and Traoré was the defender of sovereignty. As the weeks went on, international media outlets picked up the story, each spinning it through their own lens. African outlets hailed Traoré as a hero. French outlets condemned him as a manipulator. American outlets took a more cautious approach, highlighting both the symbolic power of the capture and the potential risks of escalating tensions in the region. The global audience, however, was riveted. Espionage stories always carry intrigue, but this one had the added weight of colonial history, race, and power dynamics layered on top. By capturing the French spy, Traoré not only shook his own nation, but also rattled the foundations of African geopolitics. For France, it was a humiliating reminder that its grip on its former colonies was slipping. For Africa, it was a rallying cry for independence and dignity. And for the United States, it was a chance to observe, reflect, and decide how best to position itself in a rapidly changing continent. Threatened. At the heart of it all stood a young captain turned president, defiant, unapologetic, and determined to write his own chapter in history. The story of Ibrahim Traoré's capture of a French spy is not just about Burkina Faso. It is about the wider struggle of nations to assert themselves against larger powers. It is about the courage of one leader to expose what others preferred to keep hidden. And it is about the way ordinary people, whether in Africa, America, or beyond, respond to moments that challenge the status quo. For some, Traoré is reckless. For others, he is revolutionary. But for everyone, he is impossible to ignore. This single act, whether seen as bold defiance or dangerous provocation, has already carved its place in history. And as the world watches how Traoré handles the fallout, one truth remains: moments like these remind us that power is never permanent. Influence is never guaranteed, and the fight for sovereignty will always find new champions. Threatened, the world did not stop buzzing after the announcement that a French spy had been captured in Burkina Faso. If anything, the tension only deepened as governments scrambled, media outlets speculated wildly, and the people of Burkina Faso held on to every new word from their leader, Ibrahim Traoré. The young captain had already built a reputation as a firebrand, but now, with this move, he had thrust himself onto the global stage in a way that could not be ignored. To many of his supporters at home, Traoré was no longer just a transitional leader. He was the embodiment of national pride. To his critics abroad, he had become a reckless actor, willing to provoke international incidents for the sake of boosting his image. The truth, however, was more complex, because the capture of a spy is never just about the spy. It is about the networks they represent, the missions they are tied to, and the consequences of exposing them. Inside Burkina Faso, the spy was held under tight security, and officials revealed small details to keep the story alive in the public imagination. They said documents had been found, encrypted communications intercepted, and lists of contacts discovered. Each revelation was a nail in the coffin of France's credibility. Even if Paris continued to deny everything, the Burkinabe people believed the proof was undeniable. It was no longer just suspicion, it was fact. France was meddling, and their operative had been caught red-handed. In Ouagadougou, cafes and markets echoed with conversations about what the spy might have uncovered. Was he planning to undermine the military? Was he reporting on Traoré's alliances with Russia? Was he trying to sabotage the government's new security strategy? Everyone had a theory, but they all shared the same conviction: their leader had defended them from foreign intrusion. The French government, meanwhile, worked overtime to control the damage. Behind closed doors, officials knew the capture was real, even if they would never admit it publicly. France had maintained intelligence networks in Africa for decades, some of them informal, others deeply entrenched in the structures of local governments. The idea that one of their operatives had been publicly exposed was more than embarrassing. It was dangerous. If other African nations followed Traoré's example, France's entire intelligence apparatus across the region could unravel. Threatened, Paris issued statements dismissing the arrest as a political stunt, but privately, they reached out to allies, pressured diplomatic channels, and even considered retaliatory measures. For the people of Burkina Faso, however, the humiliation of France was their triumph. Street artists painted murals of Traoré standing tall, stepping on a tricolor flag. Musicians composed songs praising his courage. Social media was flooded with images and slogans mocking France, some portraying the spy as a cartoon villain tied up in ropes, while Traoré declared victory. These expressions of popular culture reinforced the message: this was not just a political event, it was a cultural moment, when a unifying narrative that reminded people they were no longer powerless subjects of foreign control. The United States continued to watch carefully, weighing its options. Washington understood the symbolic resonance of what Traoré had done. America, after all, had its own history of capturing enemy spies during the Cold War, moments that boosted national pride and reassured citizens that their government was strong and vigilant. For a pro-American audience, this comparison was striking. In many ways, what Traoré did echoed the American ethos of defiance against foreign meddling. However, U.S. officials also recognized the potential danger in this escalation. If the situation spiraled, Burkina Faso could become more deeply entangled with Russia, creating yet another flashpoint in the ongoing competition between global powers. The challenge for America was how to respect the sovereignty narrative without losing ground in the geopolitical chess match. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré himself doubled down on his rhetoric. He gave fiery speeches, telling his people that Burkina Faso would never bow to outside pressure. He reminded them of the sacrifices of their ancestors, who had resisted colonial domination, and he framed the capture of the French spy as a continuation of that long struggle for dignity and independence. His words struck a chord, not only in Burkina Faso but across Africa. In Mali, Niger, and Guinea, people cheered Traoré's defiance. In Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal, discussions flourished about whether their own governments had the courage to stand up to France in similar ways. It was as if one act of espionage had unlocked decades of suppressed resentment and unleashed it into the open. The spy himself, whose identity remained officially undisclosed, became a ghost-like figure around which the entire drama revolved. Some said he was a seasoned operative with decades of experience. Others claimed he was a low-level functionary unlucky enough to be caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Burkinabe authorities hinted at dramatic revelations, but carefully withheld too much detail, ensuring that the suspense remained alive. Every time the government released a new tidbit of information, it was like adding fuel to a fire that refused to go out. In Paris, the crisis also played out domestically. Opposition politicians attacked President Emmanuel Macron, accusing him of mishandling relations with Africa and allowing France's prestige to collapse. Newspapers debated whether France's entire Africa policy was outdated and unsustainable. Analysts warned that the spy incident could accelerate the collapse of French influence not only in Burkina Faso, but across the region. Macron's defenders tried to minimize the scandal, but the damage had already been done. Traoré had scored a symbolic victory, and France looked weak. African-American communities in the United States followed the story with particular interest. For many, it resonated on a deeply personal level. The notion of an African leader catching a Western power in the act of interference mirrored their own historical struggles against systemic oppression and outside control. Commentators in black media outlets drew parallels between Traoré's defiance and the civil rights movement in America, noting that both were about reclaiming dignity and refusing to be dictated to by forces claiming superiority. On social media platforms, African Americans and Africans exchanged messages of solidarity, seeing in each other's struggles a shared quest for respect and autonomy. But while the narrative of sovereignty and pride dominated, real risks lurked beneath the surface. The capture of a spy is not a small matter. It can lead to retaliation, sanctions, covert operations, or even military escalation. Burkina Faso, a country already struggling with security challenges and economic hardship, could find itself in the crosshairs of a powerful adversary. Some analysts warned that France might use its influence in international organizations to isolate Burkina Faso, cut off aid, or push for punitive measures. Others speculated that covert attempts could be made to destabilize Traoré's government, using local collaborators or rival factions. Yet Traoré seemed unfazed by the risks. His public posture was one of absolute confidence, as if daring France to make its next move. In this, he mirrored the posture of great historical leaders who stood firm in the face of overwhelming pressure. For his supporters, this was proof of his courage. For his critics, it was evidence of recklessness. But either way, it ensured that he remained at the center of the global conversation. American observers saw in Traoré's defiance both an opportunity and a warning. The opportunity was clear. If Africa truly began to break free from French influence, the United States could step in as a partner, offering trade, investment, and security assistance on terms that respected sovereignty. The warning, however, was just as important. If the U.S. failed to engage carefully, Russia and China could step in to fill the void, using moments like the spy scandal to expand their reach. Thus, the capture of one French spy became more than an isolated incident. It became a lens through which the entire future of Africa's geopolitics could be seen. The Burkina Faso people, however, were less concerned with geopolitical calculations and more focused on the immediate sense of pride. For them, this was a victory that validated their struggles, gave them hope, and reminded them that their country, small and often overlooked, could command the attention of the world. They rallied around their leader, even those who had previously criticized him, because in moments of national pride, divisions tend to blur. And so, as the days turned into weeks, the story of the French spy remained alive, refusing to fade into the background. Commentators called it a watershed moment. Scholars debated its long-term implications. Activists hailed it as a turning point for Africa. And ordinary people, whether in Ouagadougou, Paris, Washington, or New York, leaned in to hear the next chapter. The weeks following the capture of the French spy in Burkina Faso were unlike anything the country had ever seen. International attention, once sporadic and dismissive, now locked firmly onto the small West African nation. What Ibrahim Traoré had done was not simply expose a single act of espionage. It had forced the world to confront the deeper realities of Africa's relationship with Europe, with the West, and with itself. And in that confrontation, nations were choosing sides, narratives were colliding, and ordinary people were finding themselves part of a story far bigger than they had ever imagined. In Burkina Faso, Traoré's popularity reached new heights. Crowds filled the streets, chanting his name, waving flags, and painting their faces with the colors of the nation. Young people in particular saw in him a reflection of their own frustrations and hopes. They were tired of poverty, tired of insecurity, tired of foreign influence dictating the direction of their lives. To them, the capture of the spy was not just about national security. It was a symbolic rejection of decades of humiliation. It said, once and for all, that Burkina Faso would no longer be a pawn on someone else's chessboard. At the same time, questions swirled about what would happen next. Rumors spread of French retaliation, of shadowy figures operating in the background, of plots to destabilize the government. Some speculated that the spy's capture had already prevented a coup attempt. Others whispered that more operatives might still be embedded, waiting for the right moment. Fear mixed with pride, but the dominant feeling remained one of defiance. France, for its part, faced a nightmare scenario. Their credibility in Africa was already waning, and this scandal accelerated the decline. In Paris, debates raged within political circles. Should France double down, flex its military muscle, and remind Burkina Faso of who held the power? Or should it attempt to quietly repair the damage, offering diplomacy and incentives to restore some measure of influence? Neither option was ideal, because Traoré had already framed the narrative in such a way that any French move would appear weak or desperate. The young captain had backed an old empire into a corner, and the world could see it. In Washington, analysts and officials observed carefully, weighing the implications for U.S. interests. America's pro-democracy values and long history of confronting espionage gave it a natural sympathy for Burkina Faso's act of sovereignty. After all, no nation tolerates foreign spies operating freely within its borders. American history is filled with stories of captured agents, foiled plots, and dramatic counterintelligence victories that reassured citizens of their nation's strength. To pro-American audiences, the parallel was obvious. What Traoré had done was, in spirit, not so different from what U.S. leaders had done for decades. But America also had to think strategically. The risk was that Burkina Faso's new alliances, particularly with Russia, could tilt the balance of power in the region. The capture of a French spy might drive the country further into Moscow's embrace. If that happened, it could create a foothold for adversaries of the United States right in the middle of Africa. So while there was admiration for Traoré's defiance, there was also caution, a recognition that pride and principle needed to be balanced with pragmatic engagement. Meanwhile, the African diaspora across the world reacted with fascination. In Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, talk radio buzzed with conversations about whether their leaders would ever show such boldness. In African American communities, the symbolism of standing up to a former colonial power resonated deeply. It was not lost on anyone that this young African leader had accomplished something that echoed across centuries of history. His act was not merely political, it was cultural, historical, even spiritual. It spoke to a desire for self-determination that transcended borders. The spy himself became almost a mythical figure in the story. Though the Burkina government kept details scarce, occasional leaks and rumors fed public curiosity. Some claimed he had been caught with sensitive documents that proved France's involvement in supporting armed groups. Others suggested he was coordinating with local elites to destabilize Traoré's rule. Each rumor added to the drama, making the spy both villain and symbol. His silence, enforced by captivity, only amplified the sense of mystery. As the narrative unfolded, the broader implications for Africa became undeniable. Traoré's defiance emboldened leaders in neighboring countries. Mali and Niger, already aligned against French influence, praised his courage. Guinea signaled quiet support. Across the continent, opposition groups used the story to challenge their governments, asking why they continued to tolerate foreign interference. The spy scandal had become more than a Burkina Faso issue, it was a continental wake-up call. Yet, even as Traoré basked in the glow of popular support, the challenges facing his nation remained daunting. Terrorist groups still threatened rural areas. The economy was fragile. International pressure loomed. Capturing a spy had galvanized the people, but it had not solved the deeper structural problems Burkina Faso faced. In some ways, the incident raised expectations to almost impossible levels. People now expected their young leader to deliver victories, not only against foreign interference but also against poverty, insecurity, and underdevelopment. In France, humiliation turned to anger. Officials quietly explored ways to punish Burkina Faso without appearing overtly aggressive. Economic levers were considered. Diplomatic pressure was applied. But the problem was that every heavy-handed action risked reinforcing Traoré's narrative of defiance. He wanted to portray France as the villain, and if Paris overreacted, it would hand him exactly the ammunition he needed. The spy incident had cornered France not only geopolitically, but also rhetorically. In America, the story was interpreted through the lens of broader global competition. The capture of the spy symbolized a larger trend, the unraveling of old colonial structures and the rise of new actors on the global stage. For pro-American audiences, it was a reminder of why American leadership remained vital. While others scrambled to maintain control, the United States still had the credibility and capacity to act as a stabilizer. The lesson was clear: the world was changing, but America remained the indispensable nation. Back in Ouagadougou, life carried on amid the political drama. Markets bustled, children went to school. Farmers worked their fields, yet the mood was different. There was a sense of pride in the air, a sense that their small nation had done something big. Even if the details of espionage and geopolitics were not always clear, the symbolism was obvious. They had captured a spy, humiliated a powerful nation, and reminded the world that Burkina Faso could not be ignored. In the end, the capture of the French spy was about more than one man. It was about the power of narrative, the importance of sovereignty, and the shifting dynamics of global power. Ibrahim Traoré had taken a risk, but in doing so, he had written his name into history. His move shook his nation, rattled France, fascinated America, and inspired Africa. It was a moment that reminded everyone, from the streets of Ouagadougou to the halls of Washington, that history is not only written by the strong, it is also written by the bold. For Americans, the takeaway was profound. The story reinforced the value of vigilance, the importance of standing firm against foreign interference, and the enduring relevance of national pride. It also highlighted the need for engagement, because as the world shifts, those who fail to adapt are left behind. Ibrahim Traoré had captured more than a spy, he had captured the world's attention. And in that attention lay both the promise of change and the peril of conflict. As the dust settled, one truth became undeniable. The capture of the French spy would be remembered not just as a Burkina event, not just as an African event, but as a global turning point. It was proof that even in the modern world, a single act of defiance could ripple outward, shaking nations, challenging empires, and forcing the powerful to reckon with the voices of those they had long dismissed. And through it all, America remained the constant. Watching, analyzing, ready to engage, ready to lead. Because no matter how the chessboard changes, the United States has always known how to adapt, how to endure, and how to turn even the most shocking events into opportunities for strength.